This is lecture 87 in the ABCs of Communism series that accompanies volume 6 in the ABCs of Communism Bolshevism 2018 when it comes out, which will be sometime this summer. And our topic today, first of all, is going to be Kenya. This is part 6 in Africa's National Liberation Wars. Now you will recall that we visited the Kenyan part of East Africa in our earlier discussions of primitive communism in the Paleolithic through the Neolithic Revolution. And since Louis Leakey's discoveries in Olduvai Gorge half a century ago, there have been many discoveries putting human evolution further back in time to some 6 million years. Anyway, from them evolved contemporary hunters and gatherers, including the modern Khoisan-speaking peoples. And these people had become tribal agriculturalists by at least 6,000 years ago. Now, autochthonous sociocultural evolution took the primitive communists into the chiefdom transition stages and then into the slave stage. Arabian slavery and feudalism arrived in Mombasa in the form of the mercantile capitalist trade, accelerating the sociocultural evolutionary process. Therefore, by the time the European imperialists of the capitalist stage arrived from the United Kingdom, most Kenyans were in the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, or in the first stage of the servitude epoch, that is, the stage of slavery. In 1895, the British capitalists established their East Africa Protectorate. Now, the anti-imperialist war for national liberation began immediately, because from the start, the land was the primary British interest in Kenya, which had some of the richest soils in the world, mostly in districts where the elevation and climate made it possible for Europeans to reside permanently. In 1894, British MP Sir Charles Dilke told in the House of Commons that the only person who has up to the present time benefited from our enterprise in the heart of Africa has been Hiram Maxim. Hello there. Maxim being the inventor of the Maximum machine gun. This in reference to Kenya's interior being forcibly opened up for British settlement by British troops that conducted atrocities against the native population. On the 1st of July 1895, Britain claimed Kenya as its African protectorate, and opposition to British imperialism existed from then throughout the British occupation. The Africans first arose in what is called the Nancy Resistance. In 1902, the British governor Charles Eliot determined that the arriving British settlers should find a way to pay for the railroad to Uganda. The way they found was to use slave African labor. In fact, over the next 3 decades, the colonial government and its invading settlers consolidated their control over Kenyan land by forcing native Kenyans to become wage laborers, but without the wages. In 1908, the nature of fighting in Kenya led Winston Churchill to express concern about how it would look if word got out. He said, quote, 160 Gusai have now been killed outright without any further casualties on our side. It looks like butchery. If the House of Commons gets hold of all of it, all our plans in the East African Protectorate will be under a cloud. Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale. Unquote. Confiscating the land itself helped to create a pool of wage laborers, but that was not enough, and the colonial regime passed laws that forced most native Kenyans to submit to wage labor, among them the 1910 hut tax and the 1910 poll tax. Then the colonial regime established reservations for each ethnic group, as in Gringolandia. This isolated black peoples. The colonial regime discouraged native Kenyans from growing cash crops that might result in their gaining political power. And furthermore, native Kenyan laborers were divided into categories called squatter, contract, or casual. So by the end of World War I, the squatter category was put mainly onto European farms and plantations. These Kikuyu squatters, Kikuyu is a big tribal and ethnic minority there, made up the majority of agricultural workers on white invader plantations. The Resident Native Laborers Ordinances formalized squatter disenfranchisement and subordinated black Kenyan farming to that of white invaders. That was how the war for democracy and freedom had played out in Africa. In 1920, the invaders changed the name of this land of their captured people from the East African Protectorate to their Kenya colony. In 1920, the Communist Party of Great Britain was formed after Michael Baroden succeeded in welding the disparate groups of would-be Leninists in England into the new Comintern-accepted party. For our purposes now, it's important to review how this political emergence of British Leninism affected the UK imperialists in their war against the people of Kenya. In a phrase, it's safe to say that they and their East African invader regime were angry and frightened of Bolshevism. From that moment forward, the CPGB fought a never-ending war of its own against every form of UK imperialism in Africa, and none was more violent than the war fought in Kenya. They knew what crimes they had committed, that is, the white regime, and the likely result now that Vladimir Lenin was astride the world stage. In 1925, the UK boss for Kenya said, quote, "You may travel through the length and breadth of the Kitui Reserve, and you will fail to find in it any enterprise, building, or structure of any sort, which the government has provided at the cost of more than a few sovereigns for the direct benefit of the natives. The place was little better than a wilderness when I first knew it 25 years ago, and it remains a wilderness today, as far as our efforts are concerned. If we left that district tomorrow, the only permanent evidence of our occupation would the buildings we have erected for the use of our tax-collecting staff." Unquote. Now, low or non-existent native Kenyan wages and the requirement for Africans to carry an identity document called the Kapandi, combined with non-representation and disenfranchisement from the land made rebellion inevitable. Government seizure of 11,000 square miles of land in the fertile, hilly regions of what became the Central and Rift Valley provinces, or White Highlands, left the native population robbed of their livelihood. In Nyanza alone, native Kenyans were left with 7,114 square miles, and 17,000 were handed to Europeans. In 1920, there was still not enough native Kenyan labor available to satisfy the invaders. 100,000 squatters and tens of thousands more wage laborers was insufficient for the white capitalist farmers. Accordingly, the invader government passed laws forcing even more Kenyans to become low-paid wage laborers on invader farms. Expropriation became the third instrument implementing the invader growth strategy for its economy. The regime in Nairobi provided white invaders with credits to build overland roads and freight subsidies for railroads, as well as agricultural and veterinary services. This was the same regime that denied any assistance whatsoever, including no medical services for black native farmers. Kenyan employees were badly treated by their European employers. White settlers, so-called, argued that native Kenyans were like children and should be treated as such, quote unquote, and routinely beat blacks to death. With no medical care and no legal rights, the native population's hours, wages, and working conditions complaints were answered with rough justice meted out by their employers. Most colonial magistrates appear to have been unconcerned by the illegal practice of settler-administered flogging. As a matter of fact, during the 1920s, flogging was the judicial punishment of choice for native Kenyan convicts. By the 1930s, for the Kikuyu people in particular, land had become the #1 grievance against UK colonial rule. In terms of lost acreage, the Maasai and Nandi people were the biggest losers of land. In 1939, the labor ordinance eliminated squatters' tenancy rights altogether. The white invaders made 270 days labor mandatory. After World War II, 1,250,000 Kikuyu had ownership of 2,000 square miles, while 30,000 British invaders owned 12,000 square miles. The colonial government and white farmers wanted cheap labor, which the government took from the native Kenyans by force. After World War II, the situation for black tenants got worse, and they fought back. On the 30th of November 1946, the Brit Governor General in Nairobi said, quote, "The greater part of the wealth of the country is at present in our hands. This land we have made is our land by right. by right of achievement, unquote. This was how the invaders had rewritten history after the war against Hitlerism and Japan. So we come to the Mau Mau uprising, which some of you at least will have heard of. Among the societies of Kenya, a process of oathing, that is, taking an oath, had long pre-colonial roots. Essentially, the concept was for men to swear loyalty to the ideas of land and freedom when they came of age. With the rise of the national liberation struggles against imperialism, oathing became attached to the ideas of obtaining freedom by loyalty to the revolutionary political leadership and then also to its armed forces, the Mau Mau. In 1943, residents of the Olenguruoni Reservation democratized the traditional practice of oathing, extending it to women and children. On the 1st of October of 1944, the Kenyan African Study Union, KASU, was formed in Nairobi. The Kenya Land and Freedom Army, KLFA, popularly known as Mau Mau, or Get Out, fighting units, would become its armed wing. In 1945, the KASU changed its name to the Kenya African Union, KAU, based on the native Kenyan trade union movement. That union movement had its mass base among the squatters on the invader estates in the Rift Valley. There were proletarians and household workers in Nairobi and on the Kikuyu reservations of the central provinces, so the KAU soon expanded into the capital and those provinces, and it was here that the overseas division of the Communist Party of Great Britain had concentrated effort. On 3 October 1952, a Mau Mau unit killed a white woman near her home in Taika. 6 days later, the native comprador boss, Senior Chief Waruhu, was shot dead in broad daylight in his car. Both of these events signaled the beginning of a war to the end against imperialism. Both acts were blows against the colonial government. Waruhu had been one of the main traders acting for the colonial occupation. In 1952, therefore, Evelyn Baring was appointed governor of Kenya. Now, Baring was the son of another big British parasite, Lord Cromer. Cromer had taken on the name of the maker of modern Egypt. At any rate, Baring immediately recruited as his top thug Michael Blundell, leader of the white invader contingent in Legislative Council. Blundell had gained some fame as a former colonel in the King's African Rifles Division. Baring told him to prepare for an armed suppression of the natives. Now, traitor Waruhu's assassination gave Baring the excuse he wanted to launch what became a genocidal war. The colonial office granted his request for a state of emergency. The Mau Mau attacks were well organized and planned. The lack of heavy weaponry with which to engage the heavily armed police and invader home guard units meant the initial Patriot attacks were restricted to the night. Later, the Africans were able to mount daylight attacks against selected invader fortifications. Now, Katunga, that is General Katunga, who was the head of the Mau Mau army, his military strategy was drawn from Chairman Mao's military writing, and his guerrillas attacks launched under the cover of dark. As had the Chinese, the Africans used captured weapons, such as guns, to get started, and they supplemented these with machetes and bow and arrows in their attacks. Again, taking a cue from the Chinese, women formed a core part of the Mau Mau forces, especially in maintaining supply lines. Initially able to avoid suspicion, they moved through colonial spaces and between Mau Mau hideouts and strongholds to deliver vital supplies and services to guerrilla fighters, including food, ammunition, medical care, and of course information. An unknown number also fought in the war, with the most high-ranking being Field Marshal Muthoni. By 1955, 90% of the Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru were oathed to the rebel command. The Kikuyu were the largest ethnic group in the KAU, the Kenya African Union. Suppressing the Mau Mau uprising in the Kenya colony cost Britain £55 million. Its war for colonial rule lasted from 1952 through 1960, and during the 8-year war, 32 white invaders, settlers, and 200 British police and army soldiers were killed. Over 2,000 African civilians were killed, along with 20,000 Mau Mau soldiers. Mau Mau civilian supporters were systematically persecuted, with large numbers of people hanged and 150,000 Kikuyu held in detention camps. The Mau Mau armies were based in the forested areas near Mount Kenya and Aberdaris, while urban militants waged the struggle in Nairobi and other Kenyan cities. The Mau Mau forest armies were broken by 1957, and in 1960 the invader regime declared victory. However, 3 years later, in 1963, Kenya received its independence from Great Britain, and one of the Mau Mau leaders, Jomo Kenyatta, became the first president of the new nation. His son, Uhuru Kenyatta, is president today, as Kenya's fourth president. In 1992, Kenyans who considered themselves Marxist-Leninists established the Social Democratic Party of Kenya, SDP. Now, the name of Social Democrat as opposed to Communist reflected the global confusion created by Russia's great traitor, Michael Gorbachev. Their leader chosen at that time was Johnstone Makau. Before the 1997 election, Charity Ngilu was selected as the party's presidential candidate, and she finished fifth in a field of 15 candidates with 8% of the vote. The party also won 15 seats in the National Assembly. In 2001, she was succeeded as party chairman by James Orengo. He stood as the party's presidential candidate in the 2002 elections, receiving 0.4% of the vote, and the party lost all 15 of its seats. Its vote share was reduced to 0.4% in the 2007 elections, in which it fielded 24 candidates, and it failed to win seats in the 2013 elections, receiving only 0.15% of the vote with 7 candidates. Then in 2002, M.Y. Kibaki was elected as Kenya's third president on the Kenyatta ticket. In 2013, Uhuru Kenyatta, son of Kenya's first president Jomo Kenyatta, was elected president to succeed M.Y. Kibaki, who died in office. Uhuru was re-elected last year in 2017, and he has spearheaded Kenya's alliance with the People's Republic of China. Which brings us to the most important point, I suppose, at the moment, which is the partnership of Kenya with China. The bilateral relationship of Kenya and China dates to 14 December 1963. That is 2 days after the formal establishment of Kenyan independence. China became the fourth country to open an embassy in Nairobi. In December 1996, General Liu Jingsong, commander of the Langzhou military region, led the first military delegation of China to Kenya. A year later, in 1997, Major General Nick Lishan, commander of the Kenyan Air Force, visited China. Military exchanges between the two countries have steadily increased. In 2005, Kenyan President M.Y. Kibaki visited Beijing. In 2013, President Uhuru Kenyatta visited China. He held talks with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. Kenya and China ended up signing deals worth US $5 billion. In 2014, the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, visited Nairobi. He and President Uhuru Kenyatta witnessed the signing of 17 multi-billion-dollar deals to fund multiple infrastructure projects and other agreements. This included the establishment of a China-Africa Development Bank. In 2002, bilateral trade had amounted to $186 million, heavily favoring Kenya. This was because China exported $181 million in equipment to Kenya, financed by the Chinese banks. At the same time, China imported $6 million of Kenyan goods, mainly black tea, coffee, and leather, paid for in cash to the Kenyan vendors. Early in 2006, Chinese President Hu Jintao signed an oil exploration contract with Kenya. These deals expanded Chinese overseas economic engagement with Africa. One deal allowed China's offshore oil and gas company, CNOOC Limited, to prospect for oil in Kenya. It began drilling exploratory wells on the borders of Sudan and Somalia and in offshore waters. In April of 2007, the Jinchuan Group, a Chinese metal manufacturing group, became the first Chinese company to enter Kenya's mining sector when it purchased a 20% stake in Human Kenya. From 2000 to 2011, there were 65 Chinese official development finance projects in Kenya. These included a 108 million US dollar grant from the PRC government to build the North and East Ring Road sections in Nairobi, and a loan to finance the construction of the Kenyatta University Teaching, Research, and Referral Hospital project. On the 1st of June 2018, a few days ago, Xinhua reported diagnostic anecdotes from Nairobi. One featured Chris Morara, who had relocated from a rural village in western Kenya 9 years ago to settle in the Athi River industrial hub outside the country's capital, Nairobi. He is described as having an unwavering quest to succeed in life. The 40-year-old father of three is now a motorcycle driver with a thriving business. That business has witnessed the growth in the industrial town he now calls home since the launch of the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, SGR, train service on May 31, 2017. On the first anniversary of that train service, Morara said it had boosted his fortunes, as the bulk of his passengers and cargo are from the Athi River terminus. Quote, "My business has improved, and we usually camp at the Athi River's SGR, that is, Standard Gauge Railway terminus, at 1 in the afternoon to wait for customers. The SGR train has created employment opportunities, promoted business, and made transport more efficient." Unquote. He said his fee of $1.50 US for ferrying a passenger to the Athi River terminus is supplemented with cargo that generates higher revenues, and the fees he charges for that, and he's determined to remain in the motorcycle transportation business for the long haul. Many entrepreneurs and workers use the famed modern passenger train known as the Madaraka Express. It makes 2 trips between Nairobi and the coastal city of Mombasa daily. Madaraka is a Swahili word meaning responsibility, power, and governance. The train has attained an occupancy rate of over 95%, while reducing the time spent connecting Kenya's 2 biggest cities by half, from 10 hours to 5 hours. The distance is 288 miles. An estimated 1.3 million Kenyans have commuted between Nairobi and Mombasa by the SGR train since its launch 1 year ago. Meanwhile, about 45,000 20-foot equivalent units of cargo have been transported via the Standard Gauge Railway cargo service since December 1, 2017, and sparing entrepreneurs a great cost compared with road transportation. Kenya's Cabinet Secretary for Transport and Infrastructure, James Macharia, said in the past year the SGR train has revolutionized the movement of people, goods, and services in the country. The China-funded modern railway has boosted the African country's GDP by 1.5%, while providing 46,000 jobs to locals. About 300 domestic enterprises were subcontracted during its construction. Chen Yun, Vice President of the China Communications Construction Company, CCCC, the SGR contractor, said at the first anniversary event that the SGR project has been an integral part of Kenya's socio-economic transformation that has benefited ordinary citizens. The Madaraka Express witnessed the advent of the nation's first batch of modern railway talented persons, including locomotive drivers. Up to now, the SGR operation business has trained 1,600 Kenyan railway professionals, Chen said. The launch of the modern railway revitalized China-Kenya bilateral relations, serving as an embodiment of Beijing's true partnership with East Africa's largest economy. A survey conducted by the leading polling firm Ipsos in April of this year, 2018, revealed that China has become the most favored development partner by Kenyans thanks to Beijing's robust involvement in their country's economic development. Raphael Tuju, Secretary General of the Uhuru Kenyatta's ruling Jubilee Party, said in a recent interview with Xinhua that Kenya and other African countries regarded China as a strategic partner in their quest to boost trade and infrastructure development. If you ask any Kenyan about China, the first thing that crosses their mind is the standard gauge railway linking Mombasa and Nairobi and Guangzhou, where Kenyans go to buy clothes and other items. Now, Kenya's budding entrepreneurs agreed that the SGR has not only promoted China's image in the country, but has also been instrumental in transforming regional commerce. Shadrach Kimiyu, a 30-year-old owner of a hardware shop, said that his revenue has increased thanks to faster, cheaper, and more efficient means of transportation for construction materials now guaranteed by the SGR. In a speech read on his behalf by Managing Director of Kenya Railways Corporation, Atanas Maina, Minister James Macharia said that the Madaraka Express has unleashed huge benefits to critical sectors of the economy, especially those in manufacturing and tourism, not to mention enhancing technology transfer. Macharia, as Cabinet Secretary for Transport and Infrastructure, added that both the train and the SGR freight service, launched in December of 2017, are crucial in driving the country's Big Four agenda, along with the pursuit of regional integration. This development agenda, launched by President Uhuru Kenyatta last year, includes food security, manufacturing, affordable housing, and universal health care. Lillian Awenja, Executive Director of the East African Business Council, said that traders from Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, and northern Tanzania are now able to import and export goods without a hitch thanks to the standard gauge railway. Quote, the SGR has reduced the travel time for imports and exports out of the East Africa region. Unquote. Awenja said at a recent business roundtable in Nairobi, and she added that the SGR has improved logistics while reducing the cost of transporting bulk goods in the region. The launch of SGR commuter and freight services was hailed by policymakers, investors, and experts as a giant step towards the creation of a formidable regional market for goods, services, technologies, and skills. The China Road and Bridge Corporation, CRBC, implemented the Mega Infrastructure Project. It is an early result of the China proposed Belt and Road Initiative to build trade and infrastructure networks connecting Asia with Europe and Africa along the ancient Silk Road routes. Professor Girashan Ikiara, an international economics expert at the University of Nairobi, said that the modern commuter and our cargo trains will promote growth, prosperity, and cohesion in the larger Eastern African region. On the 2nd of June 2018, 3 days ago, Xinhua reported from Nairobi that there is need for China and African partners to embark on a dialogue leading to improved bilateral cooperation. This conclusion about evolving geopolitical dynamics came from top scholars attending the 20th Wanshu Forum in Nairobi. The event was held outside of China for the first time. Over 50 Chinese and Kenyan scholars attended the Wanshu Forum that brainstormed on building a China-Africa community of shared future through international cooperation in advancing the Belt and Road Initiative. Li Shuhang, Minister Counselor at the Chinese Embassy in Kenya, said that robust interactions and knowledge sharing will catapult Sino-African ties to a new era of mutual benefits. He said, quote, both China and Africa have entered a new era with new opportunities and demands. China needs Africa more than ever, and Africa needs China more than ever too, unquote. He added that China and African countries should forge strong ties in their pursuits of common goals like economic growth, social renewal, and environmental protection. Kenya became the first country to host the 20th version of Wanshu Forum, whose theme was opening a new era of China-Africa cooperation in the context of South-South cooperation. Kenyan scholars hailed the hosting of the forum to discuss novel ways to revitalize Sino-Africa cooperation ahead of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, summit to be held in Beijing in September this year. James Combo, acting Vice Chancellor of Daystar University, said that African countries could draw lessons from China's experience in technology, innovations, and economic resilience to tackle the endemic challenges of the continent. The Belt and Road Initiative will help build our capacity, enhance training, transfer of knowledge and skills to boost economic development in Africa, Combo remarked. He noted that China's image in Africa has rapidly improved thanks to its huge investments into strategic areas like manufacturing and transport infrastructure. Dong Weihua, Deputy Secretary General of China Council for BRICS, BRICS, think tank cooperation, said that robust exchanges between Chinese and African scholars is a key to addressing threats facing both partners that include protectionism, communicable diseases, terrorism, and environmental depletion. She emphasized that both China and Africa share a common heritage and destiny, hence the need to improve cooperation across economic, political, social, and technological spheres. Quote, in the new era, all stakeholders in China and Africa, including think tanks, need to intensify exchanges of experiences and mutual learning and jointly explore better ways to align development strategies and broaden development paths, unquote, she remarked. And that brings us to a conclusion of this lecture. In the next one, we're going to move on to Zimbabwe. And that is going to conclude our lectures on Black Africa. After that, I'm going to return to the socio-cultural evolution of the Near East from primitive communism forward.